It's time to enhance the relationship between expertise and impact, between knowledge and application. Welcome to a journey of discovery and empowerment. Welcome to All Physicians Lead, the Forbes Books podcast that highlights the critical leadership role that all practicing physicians take on every day. Here's Dr. Leon Morse.
Welcome back. My guest today is Dr. Kevin Loughlin. He is a professor emeritus of surgery at Harvard Medical School and a very well-known urologist, educator, and physician leader. He had a distinguished 35-year career at Brigham and Women's Hospital, made significant contributions, of course, to clinical medicine and academic research, but also medical leadership. His expertise has been recognized. He's received awards from numerous organizations, including the American Urological Association and New York Medical College. And of course, generations of trainees have benefited from his leadership and clinical skills. Dr. Loughlin, as we get started, tell us how you decided to go into medicine. What was your upbringing? How did that play out?
In high school, I've always been interested in science, but maybe it was a tip-off to the interest in leadership. My senior year in high school, I was president of the senior class and president of the student council, and I had also done well in some public speaking tournaments. And people just said, "Oh, well, you're going to be a lawyer." And in fact, my college essays, done in September and October, when they ask you, what are your career plans? I said, gee, I think I'll be a lawyer. But by the time I finished my senior year, I had read a couple of books about physicians and so forth. And with my interest in science, I really changed my mind. And I said, I think being a physician will give me the opportunity to do something, important. It's something good. So I went from plans of being a lawyer in September to plans of being a physician in April and May. And then when I started college, I started as a biology major because, again, I enjoyed science. And then, quite honestly, I never looked back. I did, 4 years of college and 4 years of med school, and then 8 years of residency. In fact, my only regret is that, all of a sudden I was 35 years old, and I turned around and I said, all I've really done is go to school my whole life. Uh,
I know the
and
feeling. Yeah.
if I had it to do over again, what I might do differently, I'd still become a physician, but I've also, besides public speaking, I've also always enjoyed writing, and I continue to do a lot of writing, even more so now that I'm retired. And I wouldn't have minded before I was married and had obligations of being sort of a freelance journalist in the Mideast and just writing about all the fascinating things that were going on in the 70s and 80s in that region and still are going on.
Still nonstop.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So that, but throughout my life, like I said, starting in high school as president of the senior class and president of student council, I've always just gravitated toward leadership positions. It's just sort of been a natural fit for me. Uh, some people can sing, some people can dance. I tend to be able
I
to
can do
lead.
neither of those. That's
Yeah, neither can I.
I had to do
um,
something else, right?
but I've been in leadership positions, and I continue to be in leadership positions, and I enjoy it. So that's sort of an overview of what's happened.
Awesome. Yeah, a couple of things in there. It's interesting you said that, you had read a couple of books and was interested in medicine because of those. I remember in 5th grade reading The Making of a Surgeon by William Nolan,
Yep, I
and
read the
that
same
was
thing.
one.
Yep.
Which books, when you were back there, do you remember which book or books
Well,
influenced you to think
again,
about medicine?
William Nolan was at Bellevue, and I did some of my training at Bellevue, so
Yeah.
that resonated. I also read books about Albert Schweitzer and Tom Dooley.
Hmm.
And I've done some uh, medical missionary work during my life. I think probably uh, because of their influence. So those were a couple of the books I can remember reading. But
Yeah.
Nolan's book, The Making of a Surgeon, did have a very big impact on me. Yeah.
Yeah, it was profound. I have a signed copy in my library, so I'm
Oh, that's
not
that's
signed to
that's
me, but one
yeah,
that he
but
signed that
that's
I found. So,
yeah.
um, the other thing that you mentioned too, you said you sort of gravitated towards leadership. I argue, and I think you might as well, that leaders are made; they're not born. But by the time we recognize someone as a leader, there have been influences in their life that have created that persona, whatever it is, because we don't usually say, "Oh, that 2-year-old is a born leader," right? It's usually someone in high school or college or the workplace, and we say, "Oh, they were a born leader." Well, you've had church and community and family teaching you these things, sports teams, etcetera. Can you think back by the time you got to be your senior year in high school and in these leadership positions, were there big influences in your life growing up that created that leadership mentality in you?
Well, first, let me say I agree with you totally about leaders are made, not born. I would use the analogy of what I alluded to about not being a musician. I think people are born with certain inherent tendencies and certain inherent talents. Another story of my youth, my when my elderly uh, cousin died, and her husband had been a piano player. She gave my mother the piano, and of
Mm.
course, my mother thought, "Oh, this is wonderful. My 9-year-old son can learn to play the piano." And in fact, I can remember 2 years taking lessons and uh, not enjoying it and wanting the lessons to end quickly so I go out and play baseball. But um, the 3rd year, and he was this, German piano teacher with a very Teutonic, style, very authoritarian, and the 3rd and he would go away somewhere in the summer, so I had summers off, and the 3rd September, my mother said, "Oh, well, he's not coming back. We're not gonna do the lessons anymore." Well, I thought nothing of it, and again, it gave me more time to do the things I really enjoyed. And years later, I was in my late 30s. I said to my mother, I said, "Mom, whatever happened with that piano teacher? He just didn't come back one September." And she said, "Oh, honey, I didn't have the heart to tell you. He met with me that year and said, 'Mrs. Loughlin, your your son has a very good memory. He can memorize the keys, but he has no feeling for what he's playing. You know,
Uh-oh.
you're I'm taking your money. He will never be, a pianist.'"
Oh, that's
And
beautiful.
I
And
think
she
the
spared
lesson
you
there
from that for decades, yeah.
exactly, and I think the lesson there is, uh, I was not a born leader. I learned how to be a leader, the same way I was not a born musician, and that would be something beyond my ability to learn. So, you're given certain gifts by God, and, then you've got to, develop them and support them. But in terms of, uh, leadership models, one was my dad. My dad was an electrical engineer. Certain things about him, uh, he is still the most honest man I ever met. His integrity was daunting. I never even heard him tell a white lie.
Yeah.
He was quite a man. He was also very fair, and he also had vision. He was a gadgeteer. He knew, he was into color televisions before people realized that color televisions were gonna be the next big thing. So I think my dad had a big influence on me. My junior year, uh, English teacher, who was also my homeroom teacher, and was also one of the athletic coaches, Mr. Mike Lacapo, uh, really encouraged me to to write. I think he saw some native ability there, and he was a very perceptive, inquisitive man. And he was also, again, very fair. Uh, and I always admired him. And years later, I kept in touch with him. So if I had to uh, pinpoint two leaders that impacted me during my youth, it would be my dad and Mr. Mike Lacapo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Common answers, right? Family,
Yeah.
church, sports, have a leavening impact on us as we grow up for sure. Um, Lots of formal education in our business, right? You mentioned being,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
your,
Yeah.
mid to late 30s finished. I was 38 when I finished my fellowship in pediatric neurosurgery, so I know the feeling. When you look back at the transition from high school to undergrad to medical school, you're a leader in high school, you're on these sports teams, and then you're studying all the time. Do you recall any experiences that you had where there was some leadership education and training built into the curriculum there, or was that self-taught? Did you continue to pursue leadership roles in
Yeah,
medicine?
that's something that excuse me, that resonates with me, and that is uh, during college and during med school, there was no formal leadership training whatsoever. And actually, one of the things I've written about, I think, when Dr. Jones and I, were on a panel together, one of the things I mentioned in terms of physicians is that during residencies, we don't give leadership training
Right.
at all to residents. And, we tell them about, uh, you know, uh, bedside manner. We talk to them about, basic science. We talk to them about surgical skills. But doctors, by definition, are going to be leaders because of their position in the community. And one of the things, again, that I stressed in that panel that Dr. Jones and I were on together is that even beyond medicine, physicians can and should assume leadership roles in their community. Letters to the editor, op-eds, speaking at their local, Kiwanis Club, their libraries, their school committees. Physicians are invariably among the most educated and sophisticated people in their communities, and we should take a leadership role beyond the hospital, beyond our professional societies. We should be leaders in the community because of our backgrounds. The other thing, too, quite frankly, is one of the things that distresses me, and I've actually mentioned this to colleagues, is that everybody's very concerned about literacy rates in the United States, and I totally agree with that. Our high school graduates should be able to write well, and to speak well. Um, but there's also an underappreciated scientific illiteracy. Uh, I read recently something that was very disturbing that 24% of universities now have eliminated uh, distribution requirements. And I think a humanities major who goes through college without taking a single hour of some scientific discipline, whether it be uh, environmental studies or geographic studies or basic biology. Um, a college graduate, I think, is compromised in today's world with pandemics, with climate change, with looking at different energy alternatives. If you don't have any more scientific training other than what you had in high school, um, I think you're burdened with scientific illiteracy, which is just as serious if you couldn't write a sentence or read a sophisticated uh, critique or article in a newspaper. So I think one of the things we need to push as a society is more science training. And that again is where doctors can have a role. Invariably, doctors are among the most well educated scientists in their community. And we need to be involved in terms of the science that's going on in our communities. A perfect example, I'll tell you another personal story. Uh, I I view it as file it under the heading of "Let no good deed go unpunished."
We
Uh,
see a few of those.
I I live on Martha's Vineyard now, a lovely island, but nonetheless an island. And a couple of years ago, because I'm opinionated and I have a big mouth and I like to write. I wrote a letter to the editor to one of our local newspapers talking about our beach erosion and sea level rise and climate change. And basically, the point was as important as climate change is, when you live on an island, it's even more important because we can't move inland. We need to preserve what we've got. Well, sure enough, uh, the next week, somebody on the town council called me up and said the editor of the paper gave me permission to contact you. I read your article, and we're forming a climate committee.
I was going to say,
Uh,
congratulations, you're chairing the committee.
yeah, well, almost. So we're we're forming a climate committee, and I think you'd be a good addition. Send me your CV. So I sent him my CV, and he called back and said, "Yep, the town council is going to nominate you to be on the climate committee." And I appeared for the first climate committee meeting, and they elected me vice chairman, and I started doing all the things they wanted me to do. And we were interviewing all the department heads of the town, the chief of police, the fire chief, the elementary school principal, to find out how climate change was impacting them. And then, because part of being a leader, I think, is always being a student.
Yeah.
You can't lead unless you're a perpetual student.
Maintain that
And
curiosity, right? Yeah.
exactly. And I began to realize that I could do a much better job on the climate committee if I had more of a background. So I went back to Stanford and took their on one of their online certificate programs called what was it? The exact title was energy emerging tech energy innovation and emerging technologies. And it was what you'd expect from Stanford. It was rigorous. You had to select 5 out of 8 courses, and even though it was online, you had to pass them all. And the academic rigor was what you'd expect from Stanford. But I gained another skill. I
Yeah.
have more of an engineering background than I had gotten just as a biology major as an undergraduate. And I learned a lot, and I'm better for it. But I think that's also part of leadership. I realized that I could do a better job as the vice chairman leading the climate committee if I had more of an engineering background.
Yeah, because as you were telling the story, I was thinking what every climate committee needs is a urologist, right? Or a neurosurgeon, for instance, right?
Exactly,
We're we're
just to
great.
give that perspective, because
Uh,
let's face it, climate change has major impacts on health, and there's nobody knows more about health than physicians.
there you go. There you go. So in that vein, right, you said you got on this committee, you said, I see a gap in my
Yep, in
knowledge
my knowledge, yep.
base, right? Probably similar thoughts. Tell us how you became aware and decided to pursue an MBA. I know a lot of listeners, think about that. What should I do to improve my skills in the executive realm?
Well, again, that was mid-career. I went back in my late 40s, early 50s, and I realized that, medicine was changing so much. And just aside from helping to manage our own practice group, I was in, a lot of leadership positions otherwise. And I just said, I need more background in terms of uh, financial issues and what you get with an MBA. My own bias was when I was looking at MBA versus MPH, I very much was attracted to MBA rather than MPH. And the reason was, and this may or may not be fair, uh, I viewed MPH as being surrounded by a lot of doctors and nurses and medical types. And I didn't want to sit with people with similar backgrounds. I wanted to sit with bankers and people in industry that had different outlooks, different experiences than I did. And that's what I got with MBA. I went in there with a certain mindset of what needed to happen in the medical profession. And I can remember, CEOs and CFOs saying to me, "Well, wait a second, why do you think that? That's not necessarily true." So they challenged me that I wasn't just in that uh, homogenous, we're all in the medical field one way or the other. So it was very good for me to be exposed to people with different backgrounds and different skill sets. And in getting an MBA, I got more leadership training from people who were not physician leaders, who were leaders in different disciplines. So that was also helpful.
Any key things that you recall from that that helped you be a better executive in the physician space?
Yeah, I think one thing, as surgeons, one of my role models as a surgeon was Judah Folkman, who you know was world renowned, and Judah had a wonderful saying, and he was a fully trained pediatric surgeon, and Judah used to have this saying of the definition of a surgical personality was, uh, let me get this right, often wrong, never in doubt. Uh, and it's true, you don't want a surgeon that is equivocal. You want to go in there knowing that you know what to do and you'll do it right. But what I did learn in business school was one, humility. There's lots of times you can be wrong. And as surgeons, let's face it, we're used to being in charge. When
Yeah.
one of the things I liked about being a surgeon was when I walked into that operating room, the buck stopped with me. I knew I had my team, and I knew I needed my anesthesiologist and my residents and my nurses and my circulator. But basically, if that operation went well, it was on me. If it didn't go well, it was on me. And I liked that feeling of I'm the one in charge. But what business school taught me was humility. You need to be willing to say, I was wrong. I need to learn from that. And the closest thing we had from that in medicine, which I think is probably our most important conference, is morbidity and mortality, where you get up there once a month before your colleagues and say, the three components were EJ, error in judgment, ET, error in technique, or ED, error in diagnosis. And if there's a complication, it's got to be one of those three things. And invariably, the surgeon's at the bottom of it. So that I still think that running a good morbidity and mortality conference is probably the most important thing of a surgery department. And I was disappointed at times in my own institution where things were soft sold and covered up because of egos and so forth. One of the things about morbidity and mortality, it's got to be brutally honest. You've got to park all the egos at the door, and you've just got to be willing to say, I screwed up. But the good news is I've learned from it. But I got even more of a feeling for that in business school because, people in the business world, when people lose money, they're as unsympathetic as they are when a physician has a complication, and it's, "Wait a second, how did we lose 12% this quarter? There's no soft soaping here. What happened?" You know? I gained a lot of respect for our colleagues in the business world from the MBA. I think, humility and, integrity. I was wrong, and this is what I learned from being wrong, from my mistake.
Yeah, that's great. Constantly getting better, right? I mean, how many years have we practiced to combine the two of us, and you're
Yeah,
still, learning
yeah.
constantly and trying to improve
Oh, absolutely.
how we take care of patients. It's interesting that you pointed out that the idea of not being in charge, in command, when I was privileged to go to the war college while I was still on active duty, and I had started out in the infantry. And if you spend a career in the infantry, by the time you get to be, mid to late 30s, you are an expert in all things infantry. And if you're the commander of that unit, then
Yep,
people look to you for the answer. It's very much like being a senior surgeon. But then when you take it to the next level and you pin on a star or two and you're in charge of 15 or 20,000 people, now you have engineers and helicopter pilots and artillerymen and finance corps officers and legal and medical officers. And you have to go from the great quote that I remember from that. You have to go from being the person in the room who has all the right answers, which is what we're used to when we're, the senior surgeon in the group, to the person who asks the right questions. Because
yep,
everybody in that room who's briefing you is going to know their slice of the pie more than you ever will. And, I took that to heart when I started getting into senior medical leadership positions because, there you've got your CFO, you've got, your chief nurse, your, you know, legal counsel, and all these folks make a
yep.
huge contribution to running a healthcare system, and you have to be able to listen and be curious, like you said.
Well, your leadership experience shows, because you really summed it up when you said leadership just isn't having the right answers, it's asking the right questions, you know? And part of leadership is knowing what we don't know. Uh, but then being able to say, "Okay, I don't know the answer, but so and so should know the answer. So let me ask him or her uh, the question that'll fill in my knowledge gap." So absolutely, couldn't agree more. Um, the other thing that I think is sometimes lost in the medical field, but again, uh, in business school you learn, is really caring about the people that work under you. Part of the problem with medicine at times is we get tunnel vision, and people are so caught up in their own career and their own accomplishments and their own agenda, that they forget those around them, whether it be a chief looking at other faculty, or a chief resident looking at junior residents, or junior residents looking at med students. And uh, one of the people who I think was one of the greatest leaders in American military history was George Marshall. And, George Marshall sums up for me leadership in so many ways. Number one, he outranked Ike, and he could have, if he really wanted to be selfish, pushed Roosevelt to say, "I want to lead the American forces in
Yeah.
Europe." And Roosevelt said to him, "I need you more in Washington." And he was able to give up his own personal ambition and achievement to do what was best for the team. And then the other thing was, there's a quote that I remember reading from Marshall, and I've never been able to find it again. But Marshall once said, "The essence of leadership is caring more about your men than about yourself." And boy, I think every
Yeah.
leader should put that on their wall. And then another thought, as I sit here, uh, I remember uh, chief residents would ask me, I interviewed resident candidates for decades. And when they became, chief residents, we had been together for a bunch of years.
Mhm.
Uh, they they would say to me, "Well, when you interview a med student, what do you look for on their, CV and their letters?" And I said, "Well, the first thing is letters of recommendation and dean's letters, unfortunately, don't mean very much because every medical student has a dean's letter that says, this person is wonderful. He's going to be, the next Nobel laureate. And, there's nobody like him."
Right.
I said, people don't ask, medical students don't ask faculty members to write letters who aren't going to write glowing letters. But I said, there were two things that I always looked for in an applicant. And that was one, did they have a history of being a musician? Or two, did they have a history of being an athlete? And being one and not the other, in my own experience, I knew that being an athlete, you learned how to work as a team member. When you're in a track meet, you were more concerned about did your team get the most total points, not what your particular time was. As again, because of my lack of musical ability, I had no perspective there other than I could at least appreciate that to be in an orchestra, you had to be a good team member. If you played the violin, you needed to know what the trumpet players were doing and so forth. So when they'd ask me that, I said, things that resonate with me are if I see an applicant has either done well in athletics or has a musical background, that's definitely a point in their favor.
Yeah, very true. Medicine certainly is a team sport. And,
Yeah,
furthermore, if you end up being an elected leader of those teams or, the
yeah,
the principal violinist, then you've got folks saying you can lead a team, which is
yeah.
effectively what we talk about all the time. We'll pull on that thread here in a minute or two. I wanted to talk a little bit about balance. I think it's a very, very vague term, and I don't know that I'm quite certain I've never achieved anything remotely resembling balance. But everything that you've done from family time to medical to administrative leadership and publishing, research, that's a lot. Uh, wh- how did you apply this concept of balance throughout your career, and what advice do you have to folks who are in the midst of it?
Well, uh, just as important as choosing your profession and your specialty, uh, the best thing I ever did was to marry the right woman. Um, she was a cardiac surgery nurse when I met her, uh, so she knew what surgeons were like, and she married me anyway. Um,
In spite of her best
but
judgment, right?
in spite of her best judgment, but um, she has always been able to pull me back to reality, to say, uh, "You're overextending yourself," or,
Mm,
"What about us?" or, "When are we gonna go away for the weekend?" She, was always my reality check. Also, she'd be able to look me right in the eye and say, "You're wrong. I disagree." Um, and, there's nobody I trust more. And she was also good. There were people I met in the medical profession and, who I was sort of taken in by, and she'd say, "Kevin, he's a snake oil salesman." You know, I mean, she can
good
she can
judgment,
spot
yeah.
he can spot a phony from across the room, and I can't. I don't have that skill. So she has been my reality check, and my balance, and, it's important, uh that you have a wife or a colleague that is able to tell you, I think you're wrong. I disagree with you. That's an important thing in leadership, no matter whether it's in the operating room or in the clinic or on the athletic field. You need somebody that can, with all integrity, just say, I have a different opinion, and have enough mutual respect to say, okay, that gets my attention. If somebody that I respect that much says to me, I disagree with you, I better rethink that.
Yeah. No, classic. And take that on to the next level. You're retired from clinical practice at this point. Um, there's a few listeners, probably myself included, who would love your advice on how do you make that decision? When does it become obvious to you, or doesn't, to say, okay, I'm gonna hang up the spurs and continue with another phase. You're very active, obviously, in other things now, but to stop clinical medicine, how did that thought process work out for you?
I think again, because I loved doing what I was doing, and you know, I know this sounds like an old man. I trained before the 80-hour work week. We worked until the job was done. Now, I hate these people that talk about the good old days. We were no better, no worse than the current generation. In fact, they're much better than we were. They're smarter, better trained, more skilled from top to bottom. But I really loved doing what I was doing, and I never looked at the clock. But when I hit my mid-60s, I began to be able to tell that rather than getting in the office at 5:30 or 6, I'd get in at 6:30 or 7. Rather than going in on Saturday and Sunday, I'd go in on Saturday. Uh, I remember just pulling back a little bit.
Mhm.
When an opportunity arose to say, "Do you wanna be on this committee?" At first, I would say, "Well, I think, you should ask, uh, Sally or John or somebody else," thinking that I was being magnanimous and being a good leader in terms of delegating. In fact, what I was really doing without realizing it was saying, "You know what? I'm a little bit overextended now, and I can't do, at 65 what I did at 55." Um, so that it was the reality that, you know, uh, time marches on, and you've got to realize when, you're not quite what you used to be.
Yeah, I'm older than I once was, but younger than I'll be, is the
Yeah,
great
exactly.
song quote, right?
Yeah,
So
that old cliche, "Father Time is undefeated."
that's right.
You
It's
know,
the only.
it it comes to all of us.
So I pulled up a blog a while ago, and we got connected through some of your writing, the medical leadership thoughts, and I kind of try to scan the horizon and see who's thinking out there. And I kind of half joked that somebody defined genius as the degree to which someone agrees with the way you think.
Mm.
So we think a lot alike. So I think you're a genius in that regard. I appreciate it. But
Yeah.
medical leadership, past, present, and future, was one of the ones that we looked at, and a lot of really compelling thoughts in there. One of the things that, I hope to do over the next 20 years is to get some sort of leadership training in most medical schools and residencies, or at least the explicit statement that physicians are leaders so that they can self teach with the awareness that their leadership has impact. What are your thoughts on, the lack of that leadership training, and not necessarily management and finance and business training, but fundamental training in how to influence people to achieve the desired result of taking better care of our patients?
Yeah. Well, I think, it first, should be addressed by, uh, the people who are residency program directors and, chiefs of divisions and departments. That should be part of the curriculum of resident training. the same way there are certain surgical components, certain, basic science components, uh, and, uh, as we both said earlier, uh, people may have leadership tendencies, but leadership is learned. It's not an automatic. And I think there does need to be formal bullets in the residency curriculum. One of the things is that, again, all physicians, because they're educated people, should be able to write well and speak well. And unfortunately, that isn't always true. All you need to do is to go to any, national specialty meeting and see people presenting, something that they know about, let alone speaking extemporaneously. They've had a chance to prepare their slides and so forth. And so many times, the presentations are disjointed and garbled. Uh, Many times, when you're reviewing a paper, uh, just some of the grammar, some of the spelling, you say, wait a second, this person not only is a college graduate, but has multiple years of postgraduate training. So one of the things I think a program director or a chief needs to do, part of their obligation to their trainee is to make sure when they finish, not only can they operate, but can they speak well? Can they write well? Because every educated person should be able to do that. Now, I think the other thing in my view that's changing in terms of medical leadership is that, getting back to the concept of team, medicine has become so complex, and so sophisticated. Uh, you know, a generation ago, a surgeon who was trained as a general surgeon would take out a kidney in the morning and do a gallbladder at lunchtime and then do a colectomy in the afternoon. With the subspecialization of all specialties, we're now more and more part of a team. And that takes training. You need to know how to work with a colleague. You need to know how to be part of a team. And that's where, again, I think being an athlete or being a musician or having some experience being a team member growing up is important because the days of, the solitary surgeon doing it all just isn't true anymore. And very obviously, we all need PAs, we all need NPs, we all need MAs. You can't do it alone. Medicine has become so complex. You need to be able to uh, incorporate your team members into your overall view of how do I take care of patients.
You listed a few things in that blog that we were mentioning earlier: integrity, vision, humility, other key leadership traits. You want to expand on those, how important you think they are? We touched on it a little bit earlier, but here's
Well,
a good opportunity.
again, I think that across uh, occupational lines, across specialty lines, there are certain things you can pinpoint that any good leader should have. Uh, Number one, integrity. Uh, a quote that I love is from Alan Simpson, the former senator from
Mhm.
Wyoming, who unfortunately has just passed away recently. He has a wonderful quote which I often use, and that is, "With integrity, nothing else matters. Without integrity, nothing else matters."
That's right.
Um, and it's more than just, if I ask the intern, "Did you check the crit?" And if he says, yes, he did, that I am absolutely confident he checked the crit. But it even goes beyond that. If you are writing a paper and you said, okay, these were the results of the gels. Um, I've got to trust that those gels have not been doctored, so that integrity is critical. Number two, uh, the uh, uh, the ability to have a vision. So much in medicine, you can look back in my own specialty over the past 20 or 30 years. If you said in the height of the 1980s and the 1990s that the most common way to do a radical prostatectomy would be robotically, there were many people that raised their eyebrows and said, "Oh, that's never gonna happen. That's a gimmick." Well, now it's the standard of care.
Mhm.
So as a medical leader, you need to be able to see over the next hedge. Uh, you know, you need to be able to, see what the next big thing is gonna be, and sometimes it's it's not valid, but part of genius is being able to determine what's the next big thing and what isn't. I think what we've also alluded to, part of leadership, is teamwork, that basic respect for your colleague, to know that they're just as important as you are, and that uh, you need to work with them. And then I guess the fourth thing would be unselfishness. There's an old quote. I forget where I read it or heard it, but it's a cliche, but like most cliches, there's a lot of truth to it, and that is the essence of leadership is not caring who gets the credit.
Yeah.
And too many times in medicine, you see people try to diffuse the credit when they really shouldn't. Again, when you speak about a role model, besides uh, my father and besides Mike Lacapo, my English teacher in high school, uh, another leader and a role model for me was my chief, Ben Giddis, who recruited me. He accepted me into his residency, and then he asked me to stay on. And throughout my career, uh, Ben was my confidant and my North Star. He kept my vision going where it should be. But Ben always got as much or more satisfaction from the success of his trainees as he did as any uh, personal success. And I think that's probably the fourth leg of the stool, uh, is to be unselfish.
Yeah, classic. Hard to argue with any of those for sure. You mentioned building some leadership curriculum into residency programs. I'm hoping to start even earlier in medical school. Tactically, practically, how do we do that? I have some ideas, but if we're going to change curriculum, the old joke comes to mind. How many faculty does it take to change a light bulb? And the first thing that happens when you say that in a faculty meeting is everyone goes, "Change." Nobody said there was going to be change here.
Oh
So
yeah,
how do we
and
get the curriculum to change and recognize that how important leadership training is?
that's a great question. And uh, what should also be mentioned is a lot of times when you try to change the status quo, whether it be curriculum or something else, you get into turf battles.
Right.
When you try to change curriculum, people will say, well, how can any medical student graduate without having my lecture on such and such? Everybody needs to know about atrial fibrillation, much more so than, hip fracture or BPH or whatever. So you're always dealing with politics and you're always dealing with turf. I think, again, as physicians, the most persuasive thing is one, to identify the decision makers. Okay. This is the one, two, or three people who ultimately have the power to make the curriculum status quo or change, and then to confront them with data. Doctors like data. And then to say to them, okay, here's the data that shows if we give more leadership training, the results are X, Y, and Z. And there's enough literature out there now to show that, if you do this, this, or this, you wind up with better leaders, better morale, uh, things of that nature. Sort of an ancillary comment about that would be the initial resistance there was to chief wellness officers. People would say, "Well, wait a second, I'm the CMO. I don't need a chief wellness officer. I do that. That's part of my job." And what you have to gradually be able to say is, "Doc, you're doing a great job as CMO, but you know what? You're so busy doing, finances, doing academic environment, promotions, everything else. Uh, we've forgotten about the soldiers, about the docs on the front line.
Mhm.
And that's what a chief wellness officer can do. And now, chief wellness officers are not a big push anymore. Most hospitals either have a CWO or are open to considering it and talking about it. So I think an answer to your question is one, to confront the decision makers, the people that have the power to change the curriculum, and then to confront them with data.
Yeah.
Here are the facts. Here's what's been published on incorporating leadership earlier rather than later. And these are the results we get if we'll do it.
Yeah, one of the things I find fascinating, paradoxical, is that it's difficult to demonstrate that certain leadership traits of a CEO impact the performance of the organization because there are too many variables in between and too much time lag. But across industries, you can show that frontline leadership, which is where physicians are every day, leading in clinics and ORs and ERs and trauma bays, and
Oh,
that
absolutely.
frontline leadership impacts the environment, morale, as you said, turnover, which is
Yeah,
a huge issue,
yeah,
error rates,
yeah.
and ultimately patient experience and patient outcomes. And, improved
And
leadership
with
can
your
improve all of
military
this.
experience, that was the gold standard.
Right.
You know, uh, leadership was key. And let's face it, there are a lot of lessons from the military that can and should be transferred to the medical profession. So again, we're in agreement.
Yeah, and, engagement too. People are easily distracted, throughout humanity, but even more so now, no doubt. And if you've got someone who is motivated, wants to be there, wants to contribute because of great leadership in their small unit, then that engagement is a huge multiplier for performance.
Yeah.
So, um, the leader knowing when to fire themselves, I could quote, if I remember correctly, you had opined on that. Tell us what that means to you and how that works.
Yeah. I think it gets back to having, whether it be a family member or a personal friend or a trusted colleague, you know, a uh, I wrote about this. A leader needs to have somebody uh, in their inner circle. It doesn't have to be one person, it can be a couple that you meet with regularly, that you trust and can tell you when you're wrong. And it's important for those around you, and you trust them. They don't have their own agenda. They're not looking for your job, if you will, but have the ability to say to you, so and so, you've been in this job for 10 years and you've done a great job, but both for you and for the organization, it's probably time to do something else. The Mayo Clinic used to have a rule. I don't know if they still do, but um, after 10 years, a chief of a department had to step down. It was a 10-year appointment.
Mhm.
Um, it's important to know when to leave, but sometimes we're all in various states of denial. Uh, you know, um, I know that I can't run a marathon anymore, even though I'd like to. Um, And part of it is your own reality check, but part of it is having a trusted coterie of advisors that are able to say to you, you know, you've been doing this for 10 years. It's good for everybody if you move on and be positive,
Yeah.
bring your talents and now your experience to something else.
To do other
Um,
things. Yeah.
but I think, the tradition in medicine was, uh, if you were a wunderkind and were the head of a program at age 40, you stayed there until, you dropped or you died or, something. And nobody can stay at the top of their game for that long.
Well, that's it's great. That sort of hits home for me at 63, so I'll keep that good advice in mind. Kevin Loughlin, thank you very much for joining us here. I appreciate your time.
Not at all. It's been enjoyable, and thank you for asking me. I'm flattered.
This has been All Physicians Lead. We can all be better leaders, and our teammates and patients will be the beneficiaries. Go to allphysicianslead.com to unlock your potential, sharpen your impact, and elevate your journey. All Physicians Lead with Dr. Leon Morse is a production of Forbes Books.